Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at this panel discussion from the All-In Summit 2024.
It was a lively one.
It had some really interesting viewpoints, and we're going to be going through some of the highlights from this panel discussion between John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, two very prominent thinkers, two very different ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting things about this particular discussion is that they agree on certain very fundamental things, but they come to very different conclusions.
Yeah, they both see the world as a pretty scary place right now.
Absolutely.
And they both see like a potential for like major conflict.
Yeah.
But they have very different ideas about like what the US's role should be in all of this.
Right, and even what the fundamental like causes of that instability are.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both very critical of U.S. foreign policy in many ways, but I think Sachs is more.
Yeah, Sachs is definitely more of like a dove.
Yeah.
Whereas Mearsheimer is more of like a realist. Like he's just like,
Power politics. This is the way the world works.
this is how it like deal with it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So we're going to be jumping into some of these different topics.
Yeah.
I think one of the ones that really jumped out at me was this whole idea of the deep state.
Okay.
Which Sachs kind of pushes back against.
Right.
He really doesn't like this term deep state, and he's very critical of people who use it. And he sees U.S. foreign policy as really being driven by just this thirst for power, like this need to be the global hegemon.
He sees that as a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
That this pursuit of hegemony is what is driving a lot of the instability in the world.
And so he thinks that, like, if the U.S. would just kind of, like, step back a little bit,
Yeah.
stop trying to be the world's policeman,
Right.
that things would actually be a lot better.
Right. And he even uses this anecdote about, he has a friend who's an Afghan economist who was essentially ignored by the State Department during the war in Afghanistan. And he uses this as an example of how even when we're claiming to be engaged in these nation-building exercises, we're not actually taking advantage of the best expertise available.
Right.
And so, it really calls into question, what are the real goals here?
Yeah, what are we really doing over there?
Yeah.
Now, Mearsheimer has a very different take on this whole deep state thing.
Okay.
He defines the deep state as basically the administrative state, like these huge bureaucracies
Right.
that have their own agendas.
The intelligence agencies, the military.
Yeah, the military-industrial
Right.
complex, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And he sees these institutions as like wielding a lot of power over foreign policy.
Right. And he's not necessarily saying it's a nefarious cabal or anything like that.
Right.
But that they have their own interests and they're going to pursue those interests.
Yeah. And he sees that as being like a major factor in driving U.S. foreign policy.
And what's interesting is he agrees that the U.S. acts like a ruthless great power,
Yeah.
but he chalks it up to America's values. He sees this belief in American exceptionalism
Oh, interesting.
as really the driving force behind that.
So he's saying it's not just like a cynical...
It's real politics.
Yeah.
It's that we genuinely believe that we are the good guys.
Yeah.
And that we have the right to tell everybody else what to do.
Wow.
And, he points to Iraq and Afghanistan as examples of how this belief in American exceptionalism can backfire.
So is he saying like, even though he's a realist, he's saying like ideology
Yeah.
still plays a role?
Ideology plays a huge role.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So we have these two very different perspectives on what's driving U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important question for us to consider, like, as we're thinking about these issues, like, what do we believe is driving U.S. actions in the world?
Right. And where do we stand on this whole deep state debate?
Yeah, like, is it a real thing?
Or is it just a convenient narrative that people use to explain away things that they don't like?
Right. And I think it's a question that's worth really thinking about.
Absolutely.
Because it has big implications for how we view the world and how we view America's role in the world.
Yeah. So that's kind of the deep state debate in a nutshell.
Yeah. So now let's move on to the big one.
Okay, the big one.
China.
Yeah.
Is China a threat to the U.S., or can these two giants find a way to peacefully coexist?
That is the question of the hour, isn't it?
It is the question of our time, I think.
Yeah.
And Mearsheimer, as you might expect, does not sugarcoat things.
No, he's pretty blunt.
He is very blunt, yeah.
Yeah.
He believes that China's growing power poses a direct challenge to U.S. dominance.
Right.
And he sees conflict as being basically inevitable.
Yeah, he's a realist.
Yeah.
He sees this as the way great powers interact.
Yeah, and he draws these parallels to how the U.S. dealt with potential rivals in the past, like Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union.
Right. He points out that in each of those cases, the U.S. essentially crushed the rising power.
Right.
And, he uses that as a historical precedent to say that this is probably what's going to happen with China.
So he's saying, like, the U.S. doesn't tolerate
No,
peer competitor.
peer competitors are not allowed.
Right.
And so, he's painting a pretty stark picture here.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
But Sachs, as you might expect, has a very different view.
Right.
He sees China as an opportunity, not a threat.
Right. He's all about emphasizing the economic benefits of cooperation.
Yeah.
He even jokes at one point, he says, China's a market, got great food, great culture.
Right.
He's trying to really highlight the positive aspects of the relationship.
Yeah. And he sees this whole idea of, like, a security threat as being kind of overblown.
Yeah.
He thinks that we're kind of like psyching ourselves out.
Yeah.
And that we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy by acting like China is this enemy that we need to contain.
And he argues that trying to contain China is only going to backfire.
Right.
He points to things like trade restrictions and military buildups as examples of policies that are just going to escalate tensions.
Right, and push us closer to conflict.
Yeah, and potentially even nuclear conflict, which is obviously a terrifying thought.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that Sachs is really worried about, is that this kind of like Cold War mentality that we're developing towards China could actually lead us down a path to war.
Right, and he sees the potential for things to spiral out of control very quickly.
Yeah.
And he's urging caution. He's urging restraint.
Yeah, he's saying, like, we need to step back from the brink here, and try to find a way to coexist peacefully with China.
Right.
But Mearsheimer is not convinced.
No, he's very worried about China's military expansion in Asia.
Right.
He compares it to the U.S.'s own dominance in the Western Hemisphere.
Right. He uses this really interesting analogy. He says, imagine if China had military bases in Mexico.
Yeah.
We would not be too happy about that.
Yeah. No, we would not.
Right.
We would see that as a direct threat to our national security.
Exactly. And so he's saying, like, we need to understand that China feels the same way about U.S. military presence in Asia.
Right.
And he's worried that this is going to lead to a clash.
Yeah, and he sees this as a classic security dilemma.
Right.
Where one country's attempts to make itself more secure actually end up making everyone less secure.
Yeah, it's that classic, like, action-reaction cycle.
Exactly.
Where, one country builds up its military, the other country feels threatened, so they build up their military, and it just keeps escalating.
And it can very easily spiral out of control.
Yeah, and so Mearsheimer is saying, like, we need to be very careful here, and we need to avoid this kind of, like, tit-for-tat escalation.
Right.
But he's not very optimistic about our ability to do that.
No, he seems to think that conflict is almost inevitable.
Yeah, he seems to think that we're kind of on a collision course with China.
Yeah.
And that it's just a matter of time before something blows up.
And to make things even more complicated, we have India entering the picture.
Right.
As another rising power.
Yeah, India is this whole other wild card.
Absolutely.
And both Mearsheimer and Sachs acknowledge India's growing importance.
Yeah.
But they have different ideas about what role India is going to play.
Right.
Mearsheimer sees India as a potential ally for the U.S. in containing China.
Right.
Whereas Sachs sees India as a major power in its own right.
Yeah.
With its own interests to pursue.
And he even refers to India as a superpower at one point.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty significant statement.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't think of India as a superpower yet.
Right.
But Sachs is saying, like, they are becoming a superpower.
Yeah.
And we need to start treating them as such.
Absolutely.
So this is the kind of the complex geopolitical landscape that we're dealing with right now.
It's a multipolar world.
It is.
With a lot of moving parts.
Yeah. And a lot of potential for conflict. So how should the U.S. approach China in this new multipolar world?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is the question that we need to be asking ourselves.
Should we be trying to contain China's ambitions?
Right.
Or is there a more cooperative path forward?
Yeah. Can we find a way to coexist peacefully?
Or are we destined for conflict?
Yeah, and I think those are the big questions that we're going to be grappling with as we continue this deep dive.
Absolutely. I mean, these are questions that everyone should be thinking about because they have huge implications for all of us.
Yeah, this is not just some abstract academic debate.
No.
This is about the future of the world.
This is about the future of our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, so we need to be paying attention to this stuff.
Absolutely.
So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to be diving into some more specific topics.
We're going to be looking at the Middle East.
Yeah, the Middle East.
And the potential for conflict there.
Which is a very scary thought.
It is.
But we'll get to that after the break.
Sorry. See you in a few minutes.
See them.
All right. So, one of the really interesting things is how these two guys look at the Middle East, and they have very different perspectives on what's going on there and what the U.S.'s role should be.
Yeah. I mean, you have Mearsheimer, who's, really focused on those power dynamics. Like, he sees Iran as this major threat.
Yeah.
Potentially pulling in, all these other global powers into a regional conflict.
Right.
And then you have Sachs, who's really critical of the U.S.'s role.
Yeah.
He thinks that, America's unwavering support for Israel is actually contributing to the instability and making peace almost impossible.
It's like they're looking at the same map, but seeing totally different roads to war.
Totally. It's fascinating.
One's focused on like traditional rivalries, and the other one's focused on like the unintended consequences of actions.
It's crazy.
And this difference in how they see things also extends to how they view institutions, like international institutions and stuff.
Yeah.
Sachs really believes in the power of diplomacy and working within that framework of international law.
Yeah.
But Mearsheimer is kind of like, well, the world's a messier place than that.
Yeah.
Power ultimately trumps rules.
Yeah, he's like a rules are for suckers kind of guy.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So it's that classic idealist versus realist debate.
Right.
But with nuclear weapons in the mix, the stakes are so much higher.
Yeah, you really gotta wonder, are we like sleepwalking into a disaster?
Right.
And this brings us back to that core question. Is there any way to break free from this seemingly inevitable march toward conflict?
Mearsheimer, the realist, says great power competition.
Yeah.
That's just how the system works.
So we're stuck.
Pretty much. He's like, yeah, that's the tragic reality.
It's depressing.
It is kind of depressing, yeah.
But Sachs isn't ready to give up yet.
No, he's not.
He pushes back against those assumptions.
Yeah.
And he says, look, in the nuclear age, those old rules of great power politics just don't apply anymore.
If you have a full-blown conflict between nuclear-armed states,
yeah,
everyone loses.
Right, everybody's dead.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So he's calling for a new approach, one that prioritizes caution de-escalation.
Yeah.
Recognizing our shared interests, even if we're rivals, we have to cooperate to survive.
It's like a little glimmer of hope.
It is a little glimmer of hope.
Yeah, in this often very depressing world of geopolitics.
It is refreshing to hear.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes these conversations so interesting, is you're not just listening to experts parrot talking points.
Yeah, it's like a real debate.
It's a real intellectual battle.
Yeah.
Over the future of the world.
These guys really care.
They do. They really do.
They're not just phoning it in.
No, they're really grappling with these big issues.
And what I find so remarkable is that despite their disagreements, they both share this deep concern for the future.
They both recognize the dangers of escalation.
Right.
Especially in a world with nukes. And that's where the common ground is. It's just their solutions are very different.
It really comes down to do we cling to these old ways of power politics?
Yeah.
Or do we try to forge a new path?
Right.
That recognizes how interconnected we are.
And how much we need to cooperate.
Yeah. It's a big choice.
Huge choice.
And a great example of this is the U.S. decision to restrict trade and technology to China.
Right.
Mearsheimer sees that as a necessary step.
Yeah, gotta contain China.
Gotta protect our interests.
Right.
But Sachs says those policies are actually making things worse.
They're pushing China away. They're increasing the risk of conflict.
And he makes a really good point about the economic benefits of engagement.
Remember when he talked about China entering the World Trade Organization?
Yeah.
He was like, look, it made China richer, but it also made the U.S. richer.
Yeah.
It made the global economy richer.
Yeah, it was a win-win.
It was a win-win.
Right.
And he thinks we can find more win-win scenarios if we stop thinking in these zero-sum terms.
Yeah, if we move away from that Cold War mentality.
Exactly.
And then the military buildup in the Asia Pacific, again, Mearsheimer sees that as a necessary response.
Got to deter China.
Got to maintain that balance of power.
Right.
But Sachs sees it as a dangerous escalation.
Could spiral out of control.
He brought up this really interesting idea of choke points.
Yeah.
These strategic waterways that the U.S. has traditionally used to control access to the region.
Right.
And he's saying that by trying to maintain that control, we're provoking China.
And increasing the likelihood of a confrontation.
Yeah.
And he even says, try to see things from China's perspective.
Yeah.
Imagine if somebody else was trying to control the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
Or the Caribbean Sea.
We would freak out.
We would lose our minds.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, we need to apply that same logic to China.
Yeah.
Recognize that they have legitimate security concerns too.
That's such an important point.
It is
Like trying to understand where the other side is coming from.
empathy.
Empathy, yeah.
It's kind of a radical concept in foreign policy.
Maybe that's the missing ingredient.
It might be.
Maybe we just need a little bit more empathy.
And that leads to a really profound question.
Okay.
Can empathy, can understanding
Yeah.
actually overcome these deep-seated forces of power and self-interest?
That Mearsheimer talks about.
Yeah. Can we break free from this cycle of rivalry?
Or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
That's a heavy question.
It is.
Leaves us with a lot of uncertainty about the future.
But it's also a really thought-provoking question.
It is.
So I want to throw this out to our listeners.
Right.
What do you guys think?
What do you think?
Can empathy and understanding really triumph in the face of power politics?
Let us know.
One thing that really struck me about Sachs is he's not afraid to call out what he sees as hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, yeah. He does not hold back.
No, he uses some pretty strong language, actually.
Yeah, he called some of the actions in Libya and Syria, he called them games and even used a bleeped out word.
Yeah, we can't repeat that one.
No.
But it's clear he believes there's a real disconnect between what the U.S. says it wants and what it actually does.
Right. He thinks we're not always living up to our own ideals.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to this really crucial point about the nature of power.
Okay.
Mearsheimer argues that the pursuit of power is a zero-sum game.
One country wins, the other one loses.
Right. There can only be one winner.
Yeah.
But Sachs believes that power can be wielded in a different way.
Okay.
He sees the potential for cooperation and mutual benefit.
So both sides can win.
Yeah, everyone can win.
Interesting.
So it's like two completely different worldviews.
Yeah, one is very competitive.
Yeah.
The other is more cooperative.
Right. And so, when it comes to China, Mearsheimer advocates for containment.
Keep him down.
Don't get too strong. But Sachs says that's not going to work.
It's just going to lead to escalation.
It's just going to lead to escalation. Yeah, it's going to make things worse.
And nobody wins in that scenario.
Right.
He uses this great analogy, actually.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
He compares the U.S. fear of Chinese military bases in Mexico
Right.
to China's fear of U.S. bases in Japan and South Korea.
Yeah.
He's saying, let's put ourselves in each other's shoes.
Right.
And try to understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And see if we can find a way to coexist peacefully.
Yeah, without resorting to threats or violence.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
It's a powerful reminder that perspective matters.
Yeah, and speaking of perspective, let's talk about India.
Okay, India, the rising power.
Yeah, both experts acknowledge that India is becoming a major player on the world stage.
Absolutely.
Mearsheimer sees India as a potential ally for the U.S. in containing China.
Okay.
But Sachs sees India as a major power in its own right.
They're not anybody's pawn.
Right. They have their own interests.
Yeah.
And he even calls India a superpower.
A superpower, wow.
Which I think might surprise some people. But when you consider India's size and its economic growth and its military capabilities, it's like, yeah, they're becoming a superpower.
It makes sense.
It does make sense.
So the question is, how are they going to use that power?
Right. Are they going to side with the U.S.? Are they going to try to play a balancing role between the major powers?
That's the big wild card.
Yeah, it's something we need to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways?
Okay, let's recap.
First, this multipolar world is complicated.
It is.
There are no easy answers.
Lots of competing interests.
Yeah, and the potential for miscalculation is high.
The stakes are very high.
Yeah.
Especially with nuclear weapons in the mix.
So we need to be very careful.
Absolutely.
Second, we need to understand how different perspectives shape events.
Right. We have Mearsheimer's realism.
Yeah, the world is a struggle for power.
And then Sachs with his focus on cooperation.
Right.
And finding those win-win solutions.
Yeah, and both perspectives have something to offer.
They do.
I think it's important to be aware of both of them.
Absolutely.
Third, we should always question the narratives.
Don't just take things at face value.
Right. Look beyond the rhetoric. Examine the motivations.
And the consequences.
Yeah.
And finally, we're left with some big questions.
Okay, hit me.
Can the pursuit of power ever truly guarantee security?
That's a good one.
Especially in the nuclear age.
Yeah.
Are there alternative paths to peace?
Can we break free from these cycles of rivalry and violence?
Can cooperation and interdependence win out in the end?
These are questions that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, there are no easy answers.
But that's what makes these discussions so important.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
That's what the deep dive is all about.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.